Some guy started a fake HOA, started fining everyone. My wife and I were just starting out as a married couple. My grandfather had passed away a few months earlier and left me a big chunk of money. He told me to use it wisely to start a good life for my wife and me. My father-in-law worked at a real estate company that bought houses that people couldn't keep anymore and fixed them up. He knew a great starter house for us and agreed to pay for the fixing up part, with the understanding that we'd pay him back when we could afford it or after 2 years when we sold the house. We bought the house, and it took about 3 months to get it ready before we could move in. Finally, we moved into our new home. We'd been there for about 2 weeks when someone knocked on our door. He said he was the president of the Homeowners Association, HOA, and asked for our landlord's information. We told him that we were the owners, not renters. He asked to speak to my parents, but I told him again that I was the homeowner. I asked him what he wanted. He explained that there was an HOA for the neighborhood and I needed to sign the HOA rules. He said I owed $90 because I was late joining the HOA, but that he would give me 30 days to pay. However, he wanted me to sign the rules right then. I told him I wanted to read them first before I signed anything. He was really pushy about signing them right away. I refused, and he said I had 7 days to sign them. He told me that they could legally fine me if I didn't sign the rules in time. I called my in-laws because I didn't know anything about HOAs and asked for their advice. My father-in-law got really mad, saying that they should have told us about the HOA before we bought the house. He said that sometimes that information gets missed when people buy houses from the government. We decided that the $30 a month fee wasn't too bad, especially because the HOA provided a nice playground for the neighborhood. So I signed the rules. There were a couple of rules that seemed a little over the top to me, but I agreed because I thought I didn't really have a choice. Everything seemed okay for about a month. We had a small housewarming party with a couple of friends. There were less than 8 people there, including my wife and me. Our house was small, but it had a nice deck, so we were hanging out in the backyard, having a small fire in a fire pit that one of our friends gave us. Then I heard someone knocking at the door. No, not just knocking. He was banging on it, like a cop. I walked around the house, and there was the HOA president. His car was parked in front of our house, with a yellow police light on top. I'm serious. I asked him what he wanted. He told me very seriously that we were breaking the HOA rules by having a party outside of the allowed hours. There was a 10 p.m. curfew. He said I had to send my friends home or bring the party inside. I checked my watch. It was 10:05 p.m. I couldn't believe it, but we brought the party inside anyway. The very next day, I got a letter from the HOA saying that I had a warning for breaking the rules by throwing a wild bonfire, which was a safety hazard. They also said I was drinking. I hadn't even had a drink. Whatever, I brushed it off and thought it wasn't a big deal. 6 to 9 months later, we were hosting a teen group devotional for our church one afternoon. We were playing football in the street. We lived on a small street that didn't get a lot of traffic and had only 2 houses on it, ours and the family across the street. Their kids were playing with us. Then I heard a police siren and saw the yellow light flashing. The HOA president got out of his car and told us we had to stop playing right away because it was a safety hazard. He said one of the kids could get hit by a car. I was so frustrated. I told him the kids were fine, we were watching for cars, and he was the first car we'd seen. We'd been playing for over an hour. He wouldn't listen and asked what would happen if an ambulance or a police officer needed to get to our street in an emergency. This was dumb because our street had entrances from the main road, so emergency vehicles could get to us easily. I finally gave up and we went inside. The next day, I got a letter saying I was being fined $60. This was the maximum fine for a first offense. The letter said I could attend the next HOA meeting if I wanted to challenge the fine. I decided to protest the fine, but the letter said I had 30 days to pay the fine, and the next HOA meeting wasn't for another 35 days. I decided not to pay until after the meeting and wrote a letter to the HOA president telling him that. I went to the meeting. The only people there were me, the HOA president, the secretary, the president's wife, the vice president, the president's neighbor, and the treasurer, the vice president's wife. My protest was immediately rejected, and I was charged a $30 late fee for not paying on time, even though I had told him I wouldn't. I was fed up. I couldn't handle it anymore, but I realized I didn't have any real options. 4 to 5 months later, our daughter was born. About a month after that, I was driving home late one night. I was working a second job in retail at the time. My friend in the military called me. He had been deployed when my daughter was born, and he was calling to congratulate me. When I got home, I didn't want to wake my sleeping baby girl, so I just sat in my car with the engine running because it was chilly outside. I sat there for about half an hour, and then I heard the police siren. I saw the yellow lights. Now, police sirens are really loud, and this was right in front of our house. His stupid yellow light was flashing everywhere, including into my daughter's bedroom. I got out of the car and told him rudely to turn off the light so he wouldn't wake up my daughter. He said I looked suspicious, sitting in my car with the engine running in front of my house. I explained what was going on, and he told me to go inside. He said that my history of being a troublemaker wouldn't get me any special treatment. I told him where he could go, and I sat on the hood of my car. He sat there for another 15 minutes telling me to go inside. At one point, he touched my shoulder. I told him that if he touched me again, I would defend myself. He got into his car and drove away. He circled the block about 4 times for the next 30 minutes. I finally got too cold to stay outside and went inside. The next day, I got a handwritten letter from the HOA president and vice president. They also asked me to go outside to talk about last night's incident. The president explained that he was being nice by not calling the police on me after I threatened him. I interrupted him and told him he needed to leave my property before I called the police on him for trespassing. I read the letter and saw that they were giving me 2 different fines of $180 each. This was the maximum amount. One fine was for violating the curfew, and the other was for disobeying the night watchman. I was done. I had reached my limit. This is where the revenge part begins. I started researching HOA laws and rules about fines and how to protest them. I felt like they were clearly abusing their power. I found out that HOAs have to notify homeowners 10 days before closing on a house. They also have to give homeowners the HOA rules within 45 days of buying a house, or the homeowner doesn't have to follow the HOA rules. I remembered that we didn't get the HOA rules until after we moved in, which was almost 3 months after we closed on the house. I called my real estate agent. She was a very close family friend, and my in-laws had bought thousands of houses from her over the last 35 years. I asked if she still had the paperwork, and she said she could get me a copy. I looked at the paperwork and saw that it was over 3 months after we bought the house that we were notified about the HOA. There also wasn't any disclosure statement about the HOA when we bought the house. That was illegal. The real estate agent said she must have misplaced the paperwork because it's required by law to give it to the buyer before the sale. She said she wouldn't have missed something like that because it comes to her when they do a title search on the house to see if there is an HOA. She started looking for the paperwork. 2 days later, she called me back and said that there wasn't an HOA registered with the city or county for our neighborhood. That's a big deal. I called the county office in charge of registering HOAs. I gave them the name of our neighborhood. The clerk told me that our neighborhood was registered in another city, not in our city. She said that if we wanted to start an HOA, we'd have to follow certain steps. She said that without the proper registration, the HOA wasn't allowed to collect money or have any power. Apparently, what had happened was that our neighborhood used to be in one city, but when the city boundaries changed, our neighborhood was split in half. The other side of the neighborhood kept the registered HOA, but the HOA president in our side of the neighborhood was supposed to register the HOA with the state. He didn't want to do the paperwork required to register it. I was ready to go to the HOA president's house and yell at him. But I decided to be smart about it. I talked to my neighbor across the street. He also hated the HOA. I told him what I found out, and he was furious. We talked to some other neighbors, and about 10 of us agreed that we needed to go to the next HOA meeting. Apparently, the word got out because more people came to the meeting than could fit in the library meeting room where they held the meeting. I asked to speak to everyone at the meeting, and they let me. The HOA president tried to stop me from speaking because I was late paying my fines. At that point, I was 3 weeks late on paying my fines, and there was a $30 a week penalty on each fine, so I owed about $540. I spoke anyway. I explained that I had talked to my in-laws' lawyer, who was also a family friend. We had started legal action against the HOA because they were pretending to be a real HOA, and they were taking money from us. This was fraud. The HOA president dismissed me, saying I didn't know what I was talking about and that he had had enough of my antics. The rest of the HOA staff left the meeting. The rest of the homeowners stayed and talked about what to do. A month later, me and 20 other homeowners served the HOA with legal papers. We were suing them for all the fines and HOA dues that we had paid, which was about $50,000 because some of the homeowners had lived there for over 10 years. The president and vice president hired a lawyer who tried to make it look like the HOA was real. But to be a real HOA, they needed signatures from 90% of the homeowners. They got 3 signatures, including their own. Some other grumpy old woman signed too. They also tried to make a deal to get rid of the HOA and show that they hadn't made any money from it. They said they used all the money for the park, snow removal, and other neighborhood events. We voted, and they rejected the deal. I was surprised. I actually voted to accept it. A week later, one of the homeowners called me. He had something to tell me about the park upkeep and snow removal. Apparently, he had given a quote for the landscaping for the park. His quote was a couple $100 cheaper than what the HOA was paying. He said it had always bothered him that the HOA was paying a lot more for the work, and that the person doing the work was the vice president's son. This was obviously unfair. Eventually, it went to court. The judge looked at all the evidence and decided that the HOA had to pay $21,000. That was $1,000 per homeowner. They also had to pay for the lawyer's fees and court costs, which was another $2,000, so the total damages were $23,000. The city also fined the HOA after they reported what they had been doing. I'm not sure how much that fine was, though. We ended up selling our house that summer, but I talked to some friends who were still living there a year later. They said the president and vice president had both sold their houses and moved away. They said that everyone hated them, and now the neighborhood had an informal HOA where people donated money to pay for the upkeep of the park. TLDR, a grumpy old man created a fake HOA to have power over people, but he never registered it after the city boundaries changed. I sued him along with 20 other homeowners for fraud.